It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Sloane Thorne laughed as she flicked a lit cigarette onto Cassian Thorne's scuffed combat boots in front of the entire morning party. The glowing cherry bounced off the leather, leaving a gray smear of ash before rolling across the polished black marble of the Thorne estate's foyer. The scent of 1,000 white lilies was suffocating, thick and cloying, but it couldn't mask the sharp, metallic sting of her sister's expensive perfume. Dozens of guests, city council members, high society donors, and the local press, paused their hushed conversations, their eyes darting between the two sisters. "Still wearing the same rags, I see," Sloane said, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room. She leaned in, the silk of her designer mourning veil shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. "I'd offer you a glass of champagne, but I'm not sure you'd know which fork to use for the caviar, let alone how to handle a vintage Krug." Cassian didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, her spine a rigid line of military discipline that her sister mistook for paralysis. She felt the weight of the small, encrypted drive tucked into her inner pocket, its hard edges a silent promise against her ribs. She didn't look at the ash on her boot. She looked at the slight tremor in her sister's hand, the way the younger woman's eyes were bloodshot behind the carefully applied mascara. "The service was lovely, Sloane," she replied, her voice low and steady. It was a tactical tone, one designed to de-escalate while gathering intel. "Father would have appreciated the theatrics. He always said you were the only one who could turn a tragedy into a PR opportunity." Sloane's smile sharpened into something jagged. She turned to the man standing at her elbow, a tall, polished figure in a bespoke suit who looked like he'd been carved from ice. "You remember Julian Vane, don't you? He's the CFO of Thorne Holdings now. He's been helping me reorganize the estate since Father's unfortunate decline." Julian offered a thin, rehearsed smile that didn't reach his eyes. He checked his gold watch, the metal catching the light with a flash that felt like a taunt. "It's a pleasure, Cassian, though I wish the circumstances were more favorable for your return." "I'm sure you do," she said. She noticed the way Julian's gaze flickered towards Sloane for approval. He wasn't a partner, he was a leash holder. Sloane took a long, dramatic sip from her flute, her gaze sweeping over the crowd to ensure they were still the center of attention. "Actually, everyone, I have a small announcement to make before we head to the cemetery. Since my sister has been so preoccupied with her little government projects abroad, she's been out of the loop regarding the family legacy." A hush fell over the foyer. Even the catering staff stopped moving. "Thorne Shipyards is being liquidated," Sloane announced, her voice ringing with a terrifying lack of remorse. "Julian and I have already signed the preliminary contracts. It's time to move the family name away from grease and rust and into the digital future. We don't need a crumbling dock and a bunch of uneducated laborers like Captain Elias dragging down our portfolio." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Captain Elias had been their father's right hand for 40 years. The shipyard was the heart of the town's economy. Cassian felt a surge of cold fury, the kind that usually preceded a breach and clear. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the brass key Silas Thorne had pressed into her hand during her last secret visit to the hospital. He had known this was coming. He had known his youngest daughter's greed would eventually outpace her loyalty. "You're selling the yards?" Cassian asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, don't act so surprised," her sister sneered, stepping closer until the scent of her perfume was a physical weight. "You haven't been here in 6 years. You don't get a vote. You're just a guest in this house now, and if you can't keep that grim soldier boy expression off your face, I'll have security show you the gate. You're a disgrace to the Thorne name, showing up here looking like a homeless veteran looking for a handout." Sloane turned her back, her silk dress swishing with a sound like a snake in dry grass. She began to laugh at something Julian whispered in her ear, the sound bright and brittle. Cassian watched her. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply reached down and wiped the ash from her boot with a slow, deliberate motion. She saw the way the guests were looking at her, some with pity, others with the cruel amusement of the elite watching a fall from grace. They thought they were witnessing the end of a legacy. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the study, her movements fluid and silent. She didn't need their pity. She had something better. Once inside the darkened room, she pulled out her phone and tapped a secure line. It picked up on the first ring. "Sarah," she said, her eyes fixed on the portrait of her father hanging above the mantel. "The lion is awake. Start the audit on Julian Vane's offshore accounts. My sister thinks she's selling the shipyard today." "And the will reading." Sarah Jenkins' voice was crisp, professional, and laced with the same lethal intent Cassian felt. "It's in 45 minutes, Cassian replied, her gaze hardening. "Sloane thinks she's the heir to a kingdom. She doesn't realize she's just been handed the bill for a decade of fraud. Let her have her fun for now. The higher she climbs, the more bones she'll break when she hits the pavement." She ended the call and stepped back out into the hall. The countdown had begun. She watched her sister across the room, toast a group of investors with a triumphant grin, completely unaware that the floor beneath her designer heels was already starting to crack. That evening, the scent of oxidized iron and brine hung heavy over the Thorne shipyards, a sharp contrast to the expensive floral arrangements at the wake. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the dry docks where 3 generations of the family had built their legacy. Cassian Thorne stood on the pier, her boots planted firmly on the weathered timber, watching as a sleek black sedan rolled to a stop near the main office. Sloane Thorne stepped out of the car, her designer heels clicking with a sharp, rhythmic arrogance against the rusted diamond plate steel of the walkway. She didn't look like a woman in mourning. She looked like a conqueror inspecting a territory she intended to raise. Behind her, Julian Vane followed, his eyes darting toward the massive cranes as if calculating their scrap value in real time. "It's worse than the photos, Julian," Sloane said, her voice carrying easily in the salt-chilled air. She didn't bother to look at her sister. Instead, she pulled a silk scarf tighter around her neck, her expression one of pure, unfiltered disgust. "The smell alone is enough to devalue the land by 20%. Why Father insisted on keeping this rusted carcass alive is beyond me." Captain Elias emerged from the shadows of the machine shop, his grease-stained cap pulled low. He had served under their father for 40 years, his hands a map of scars earned in service to the Thorne name. "The carcass just finished the hull for the Atlantic contract, Sloane," he said, his voice gravelly and thick with suppressed hurt. "Your father was proud of the work we did here today." Sloane didn't even turn her head. She flicked a piece of invisible lint from her coat. "The Atlantic contract is a liability, Elias. Loyalty doesn't pay the property taxes, and it certainly doesn't fund the lifestyle this family is meant to maintain. You're dismissed. In fact, consider yourself permanently retired. We're moving to a private sale by Monday." The old man flinched as if he'd been struck. Cassian felt the familiar, cold burn of adrenaline, the kind she'd felt before a breach, but she kept her face a mask of stone. She stepped forward, her shadow falling over her sister's polished shoes. "The shipyard isn't yours to sell yet, Sloane," she said quietly. "The will reading was clear about the transition period." Julian Vane stepped forward, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold glinting in the dying light. "Actually, Cassian, as the CFO, I've already authorized the preliminary memorandum of understanding. You've been playing soldier for a long time. You're out of your depth in the world of high-stakes equity. Perhaps you should take your little pension and find a quiet hobby. Leave the heavy lifting to the professionals." Cassian met his gaze, her eyes narrowing. "I've spent a decade tracking people who thought they were too clever to be caught, Julian. Heavy lifting is my specialty." She reached into her pocket and felt the cold, hard edge of her phone. "By the way, I noticed some interesting discrepancies in the dry dock fees from 2019. Nearly $4 million moved through a shell company called Vane Logistics. I'm sure it's just a clerical error, right?" The smirk on the man's face didn't vanish, but it flickered. A micro-expression of panic flashed in his eyes before he smoothed it over with a hollow laugh. Sloane, however, didn't notice. She was too busy scrolling through her phone, already mentally spending the commission. Don't be tedious, Cassian, her sister snapped. 4 days, that's how long it will take to finalize the paperwork. By the time the ink is dry, this eyesore will be a memory, and you'll be just another civilian looking for a job. Sloane turned on her heel, her movements fluid and dismissive, and climbed back into the car without a second glance. As the sedan sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, Captain Elias walked over to Cassian. He reached into his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a small, oil-stained ledger. "Your father told me to give this only to you," the captain whispered, his eyes scanning the perimeter to ensure they were alone. "The digital files Julian has, they're the ones he wanted them to see. This is the truth. This is where the bodies are buried." Cassian took the book, the weight of it feeling more substantial than any weapon she'd ever carried. She looked at the gates of the shipyard, then back at the ledger. The countdown hadn't just begun, it was accelerating. 1 week remained until the final board meeting, and she now held the match that would burn her sister's house to the ground. 2 days later, the air in the windowless basement office felt heavy with the scent of ozone and burnt coffee. Sarah Jenkins didn't look up from her bank of monitors as Cassian entered, the rhythmic clicking of a mechanical keyboard filling the cramped space. The blue light from the screens washed over Sarah's face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes. "It's worse than the ledger suggested," Sarah said, her voice raspy from lack of sleep. She tapped a key, and a cascade of red numbers scrolled across the center display. Sloane isn't just mismanaging the company. She's hollowed it out. She's been using the shipyard's pension fund as a personal line of credit to maintain the appearance of the Thorne lifestyle. Cassian Thorne stood perfectly still, her eyes tracking the digital theft. She reached into her jacket and touched the oil-stained ledger she'd recovered from Captain Elias. The physical weight of it was a grounding wire for the cold fury vibrating in her chest. "And Julian Vane?" Cassian asked. "He's the architect," Sarah replied, spinning her chair around. She handed over a tablet. "He's been routing the losses through a series of shell companies in the Caymans, but he made one mistake. He used his personal encryption key on a transfer made 3 months ago. He thinks he's invisible, but he left a fingerprint on the digital throat of this company." A notification chimed on a secondary monitor. A social media feed refreshed, showing a high-definition video posted only minutes ago. Cassian watched as her sister appeared on screen, draped in a cream-colored silk wrap that likely cost more than a shipwright's annual salary. Sloane was standing on the deck of a luxury yacht, a glass of vintage champagne in her hand, laughing as she toasted the camera. "The Thorne legacy has never been stronger," Sloane's voice purred through the speakers, dripping with a performative grace that made Cassian's skin crawl. "While others dwell in the past, I am building the future. Some are born to lead, and others are simply born to follow." The arrogance was a physical blow. Cassian watched the workers in the background of the video, hired staff being treated like furniture, and thought of the men at the shipyard whose retirement accounts were currently being sipped out of a crystal flute. "She's at the estate," Cassian said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "I need to get my father's original articles of incorporation, the physical copies. If the digital records are compromised, the paper trail is our only legal anchor." "The board meeting is in 5 days, Cass," Sarah warned. "If you go there now, she'll know you're circling." "Let her," she replied. "Arrogance makes people blind. She thinks I'm a ghost. It's time I reminded her I'm flesh and blood." An hour later, the iron gates of the Thorne estate creaked open. The scent of manicured boxwood and expensive mulch filled the air, a sharp contrast to the salt and grease of the docks. Cassian walked up the gravel path, her boots crunching with a deliberate, steady rhythm. She found her sister in the grand foyer, surrounded by half-packed designer suitcases and a frantic personal assistant. Julian Vane stood by the fireplace, checking his gold watch with an expression of bored impatience. "Oh, look what the wind blew in," Sloane sneered, not even turning around as she inspected a pair of ostrich skin pumps. "The prodigal soldier returns to the scene of her failure. Did you run out of metals to polish, or are you just here to beg for an inheritance that doesn't exist?" Cassian didn't flinch. She kept her hands in her pockets, her gaze fixed on Julian. He looked away first, a subtle shift in his posture that betrayed a flicker of unease. "I'm here for Dad's private files," she said calmly. "The ones in the study." Sloane finally turned, her eyes raking over Cassian's tactical jacket and worn jeans with visceral disgust. She stepped closer, the cloying scent of her floral perfume invading Cassian's space. "You don't belong in this house anymore," her sister whispered, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "You're a relic, a reminder of a father who was too weak to do what was necessary. This house, the company, the Thorne name, it all belongs to me now. You're just a guest I've forgotten to evict." She reached out, flicking a speck of dust off Cassian's shoulder with a manicured nail. It was a calculated, demeaning gesture meant to provoke a reaction. Cassian remained a statue. She felt the hard edges of the tablet in her pocket, containing the proof of the shell companies and the stolen pensions. She looked into her sister's eyes and saw nothing but a hollowed-out vanity fueled by debt. "You're right about one thing," Cassian said, her voice dropping to a chill that seemed to dim the lights in the foyer. "Dad was too kind. He saw the best in people even when it wasn't there. But I didn't inherit his kindness. I inherited his memory." Julian stepped forward, sensing the shift in the room. Now, there's no need for dramatics. Cassian, the files are being archived. You'll have to put in a formal request through the legal department." "5 days, Julian," she said, turning her gaze to him. The CFO's eyes widened slightly. He recognized the tone, the one used by an officer who already had the enemy in her sights. "The board meeting is in 5 days. Make sure your books are balanced. I'd hate for there to be any discrepancies." Sloane laughed, a shrill, brittle sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Discrepancies? You can barely balance a checkbook, let alone understand international finance. Get out of my house before I have security drag you to the gate." Cassian turned without another word. She didn't need to argue. She had the ledger, she had Sarah's digital trail, and she had just seen the fear hidden behind Julian's expensive glasses. As she walked back down the gravel drive, her phone vibrated. A text from Sarah. "The judge has agreed to a private hearing. We have the warrant for the server seizure, but we need the physical signatures to match the digital keys." Cassian looked back at the looming shadows of the estate. The countdown wasn't just a clock anymore, it was a fuse. She had the match. All she had to do was wait for the right moment to strike. 5 days. In 5 days, the Thorne name would mean something again, even if she had to burn the house down to save the foundation. The following afternoon, the air in the sapphire room of the Grand Regency felt thick with the cloying scent of lilies and expensive desperation. Cassian walked through the gilded double doors, her footsteps silent on the plush indigo carpet. She had traded her tactical gear for a sharp, charcoal gray suit that felt like armor. It was a stark contrast to the sea of shimmering silk and tools surrounding her, but she wasn't here to blend in. She was here to witness the final hours of a crumbling empire. Sloane stood at the center of a circle of wealthy donors, her laughter ringing out like breaking glass. She was in her element, draped in a champagne-colored gown that likely cost more than a veteran's yearly pension. When she spotted her sister, her expression shifted from performative warmth to jagged contempt. She didn't even wait for the donors to finish their praise before she stepped away, her heels clicking a sharp, aggressive rhythm against the marble perimeter of the room. "I thought I made myself clear yesterday," Sloane said, her voice a low hiss that barely masked her fury. She didn't look at Cassian's face, instead sneering at the simple cut of her suit. "This is a high-stakes preview for the Thorne Foundation's expansion. We don't have room for charity cases or disgruntled siblings looking for a handout. Did you buy that outfit at a surplus store? It's a bit grim for a celebration, don't you think?" Cassian didn't flinch. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, her fingers momentarily brushing the small, encrypted drive tucked into her inner pocket. The digital key Sarah had finalized an hour ago. "I'm not here for a handout, Sloane. I'm here because I wanted to see if you'd actually go through with it. The expansion is a bold move for a company with such hollowed-out accounts." Julian Vane stepped forward from the shadows of a nearby floral arrangement, his eyes darting nervously between the two women. He looked pale, the expensive frames of his glasses sliding down his nose as he wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Sloane, perhaps we should step into the office. There are some last-minute adjustments to the presentation." "The presentation is perfect, Julian," Sloane snapped, silencing him with a sharp wave of her hand. She turned back to Cassian, her eyes narrowed with a toxic mix of arrogance and boredom. "You think you're so clever with your talk of discrepancies. You're a ghost, Cassian, a soldier who stayed in the mud so long she forgot how the real world works. You have no power here. No one in this room cares about your theories. They care about status, and you have none." Cassian stepped closer, invading her sister's personal space just enough to see the microtremor in Sloane's perfectly lined lips. "The foundation of this house is built on sand, Sloane, and the tide is coming in tomorrow night. I'm giving you one chance. Stop the expansion. Admit to the errors in the shipyard filings before the judge sees the physical signatures. If you do it now, you might stay out of a jumpsuit." Sloane laughed, a harsh, grating sound that drew the attention of a few nearby guests. "Captain Elias is a senile old man who smells of diesel and failure. His word means nothing against a Thorne. And as for the servers, they're encrypted with tech you couldn't understand if I gave you a manual. Go back to your shadows. Tomorrow, I'm announcing the new era of this family. By Monday, you'll be a footnote in a history book I'm rewriting." A few feet away, Judge Abraham Sterling stood by a towering ice sculpture, his gaze fixed on Cassian. He didn't intervene, but he watched with the practiced intensity of a man who knew how to spot a lie. He saw the stillness in Cassian's posture, the terrifying, cold confidence of a predator who had already sprung the trap and was simply waiting for the prey to realize they were caught. Cassian nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I'll take that as a no, then. Enjoy the champagne, Sloane. It's the last bottle you'll ever drink that wasn't paid for by a state-mandated commissary account." She turned and walked away without waiting for a rebuttal. She had delivered the warning. It was the last act of mercy she owed the Thorne name, and it had been predictably trampled. As she reached the exit, her phone vibrated in her pocket. A final confirmation from Sarah: "Everything is loaded. The projector is synced. See you at the gala." Cassian stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the scent of lilies behind. Tomorrow wasn't just a celebration, it was an execution. And Sloane had just handed her the match. The evening arrived with a deceptive shimmer, the kind of oppressive opulence that only debt-funded arrogance could maintain. The Thorne Plaza ballroom had been transformed into a cathedral of glass and gold, illuminated by $1,000 chandeliers that cast a harsh, unforgiving light over the city's elite. The air was thick with the cloying scent of white lilies and the sharp, medicinal sting of expensive gin. Sloane Thorne stood at the center of the room, a gilded sun around which the desperate and the greedy orbited. She was draped in a gown of liquid gold sequins that caught every flicker of light, her hair coiffed into a crown that seemed to add inches to her stature. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, her laughter ringing out, thin and brittle, like ice cracking underfoot. "It's about vision," she told a cluster of nodding donors, her voice carrying with practiced authority. "My father had the foundation, but I am the one building the skyscraper. Some people are born to stay in the shipyard, and others are born to own the horizon." Julian Vane stood at her elbow, his face a mask of sweating anxiety that even the dim ambient lighting couldn't hide. He leaned in, whispering something about the quarterly projections, but she brushed him off with a flick of her manicured wrist. "Not now, Julian," she snapped, her eyes scanning the room for more influential prey. "The judge is here. Look professional for once. We're not just selling a company tonight, we're selling a legacy." She didn't notice the man standing near the buffet line, his weathered hands tucked behind his back. Captain Elias looked entirely out of place in his stiff, dated tuxedo, his eyes fixed on the podium with a grim intensity. He was a ghost from a past she had tried to bury in legal filings and non-disclosure agreements. To her, he was just part of the scenery, as insignificant as the velvet drapes. 2 hours into the gala, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. The quartet playing Vivaldi didn't falter, but a ripple of silence followed the newcomer as she moved through the crowd. Cassian Thorne didn't wear gold. She wore a charcoal gray suit tailored with military precision, her silk shirt buttoned to the throat. She didn't have a drink in her hand, and she didn't offer a smile to the socialites who parted for her. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of someone who had spent years navigating shadows, her presence a cold front moving into a humid room. Sloane spotted her from across the floor. Her grip tightened on her glass until her knuckles turned white. She whispered a sharp command to Julian and began her march across the marble, her heels clicking like a countdown. "I thought I made myself clear," Sloane said, her voice a low hiss as she intercepted her sister near the center of the room. A few guests paused, their ears pricking at the scent of a brewing scandal. "This is an invitation-only event. Security is already on their way to escort the help back to the service entrance." Cassian didn't flinch. She met her sister's gaze with eyes that were as flat and cold as a winter sea. "I'm not here as a guest, Sloane, and I'm certainly not here as your sister. I'm here as a shareholder." Sloane let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. "A shareholder? With what? The pennies you saved from your pension? You don't belong in this room. You don't even belong in this zip code. Look at you, you look like you're dressed for a funeral." "I am," Cassian replied softly. The texture of the small, brushed steel remote in her pocket was a grounding weight against her palm. "I'm just waiting for the body to realize it's dead." The insult hung in the air, thick and jagged. Sloane's face flushed a deep, mottled red, the mask of the polished PR maven slipping to reveal the jagged edges of her temper. She leaned in closer, the scent of her perfume, something floral and expensive, becoming an assault. "You think you're so clever," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "But by tomorrow morning, the Thorne name will be mine alone. I've already signed the preliminary merger. The shipyard is being sold for scrap, the Heritage Foundation is being dissolved, and you'll be back in some dusty corner of the world where nobody cares if you live or die. Now, get out before I have security drag you through the lobby in front of the cameras." Cassian simply tilted her head, her expression one of mild, detached interest. "You always did have a problem with timing. You think the merger is the headline, but you've forgotten who actually owns the ink." She turned her back on her sister, a move of such casual dismissal that it left Sloane momentarily speechless. Cassian walked toward the front row, where Judge Abraham Sterling sat. The old man looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. She didn't say a word. She simply handed him a small, sealed envelope. He took it, his fingers trembling slightly as he felt the weight of the documents inside. High above the ballroom floor in the darkened tech booth, a small green light flickered to life. Sarah Jenkins adjusted her headset, her fingers hovering over a laptop. She caught Cassian's eye from across the vast space and gave a single sharp nod. The trap was set. The witnesses were in their seats. The judge was holding the key. Sloane, recovered from her shock, marched toward the podium. She signaled to the house lights, which began to dim. The chatter of the room subsided into an expectant hum. She took the stage, the gold of her dress shimmering under the spotlight like a false promise. She adjusted the microphone, her smile returning, vibrant, dominant, and utterly predatory. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice amplified and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate where we've been. We celebrate the end of an era and the birth of a new Thorne empire. But before we look forward, I have a special presentation that illustrates exactly why this legacy belongs in my hands alone." She looked down at Cassian, her eyes gleaming with a triumphant, malicious light. She thought she was about to deliver the final blow. She didn't see Julian Vane slip toward the exit, his face the color of ash. She didn't see Sarah Jenkins hit the enter key. The massive projector screen behind the podium hummed as it descended, a blank white canvas waiting for the first stroke of the execution. Cassian stood perfectly still in the shadows, her hand closing over the remote. "Go ahead, Sloane," she whispered to the empty air. "Tell them your version of the truth. It's the last lie they'll ever hear from you." The hum of the projector was the only sound in the cavernous ballroom. a low, mechanical thrum that seemed to vibrate against the crystal flutes of champagne held in trembling hands. Sloane Thorne stood at the podium, her fingers poised over the laptop like a concert pianist about to deliver a final, crashing chord. She smelled of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of unbridled ambition. She didn't look at the screen yet. She kept her eyes locked on her sister, her lips curled in a sneer of pure, distilled triumph. "This," Sloane announced, her voice amplified and echoing off the marble pillars, "is the reality of the Thorne legacy. While I was building an empire, my sister was hiding in the dirt." She hit the key. The screen didn't show the doctored military records Sloane had spent weeks commissioning. Instead, a massive, high-definition scan of a forensic audit flickered into existence. The header was unmistakable: Vane and Thorne Holdings, offshore diverted assets. Below it, a series of wire transfers moved in a rhythmic, scrolling crawl, millions of dollars flowing from the Thorne shipyards into a private account in the Cayman Islands. The account holder's name was highlighted in a searing, neon red: Sloane Thorne. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating the air out of the room. Cassian Thorne stepped out of the shadows near the buffet line, her posture straight, her expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. The vibrant, calculated flush of Sloane's cheeks curdled into a sickly, grayish pallor that made her heavy foundation look like cracked plaster. Her eyes, usually narrowed with predatory intent, stretched wide until the whites showed all the way around the irises, vibrating with a frantic, animalistic terror. Her mouth hung open, her perfectly lined lips trembling as she tried to form a denial that wouldn't come, her breath hitching in sharp, jagged gasps that rattled in the sudden silence of the ballroom. She looked smaller, suddenly, the designer silk of her gown hanging off her frame like a shroud. "What is this?" Judge Abraham Sterling demanded, his voice booming from the front row. He stood, his silver hair catching the light as he peered through his spectacles at the scrolling list of felonies. "Julian, explain this immediately." Julian Vane didn't explain. He didn't even look back. He was already halfway to the service exit, his face the color of ash as he realized the ship wasn't just sinking. It had already vanished beneath the waves. Sarah Jenkins stood by the tech booth, her arms crossed, a grim smile of satisfaction playing on her lips as she watched the data she had spent months unearthing dismantle a dynasty in seconds. Near the back, Captain Elias took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey, his weathered face breaking into a nod of silent respect toward the woman standing in the center of the storm. "Sloane," Cassian said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. It was the sound of a blade clearing a scabbard. "You spent so much time telling these people I didn't belong in this room. You were so focused on the seat at the head of the table that you never bothered to check who actually owned the chair." Sloane lunged for the laptop, her movements clumsy and desperate, but the screen changed again. A scanned document appeared, the original, unedited will of Silas Thorne, bearing a digital timestamp that predated the one Sloane had used to seize control. The judge gasped, leaning forward so far he nearly toppled. "The shipyard, the accounts, and this very building," Cassian continued, her tone as cold as a winter morning in the mountains. "They don't belong to the Thorne Empire. They belong to me. And as of 5 minutes ago, the board has been notified of your immediate removal for gross financial misconduct." Sloane gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged, wet sobs of fury and fear. She looked at the crowd, searching for a single friendly face, but the elite of the city were already pulling away. They moved in a collective, physical wave, widening the space around her as if her failure were contagious. Cassian didn't wait for the security team she knew was already in the lobby. She didn't stay to watch her sister collapse onto the stage. She turned on her heel, the hem of her simple black dress snapping with the precision of a soldier's turn. "Clean up your mess, Sloane," she said over her shoulder, her voice devoid of pity. You have until sunrise to vacate my house." She walked out the main doors, the sound of her steady footsteps echoing long after the heavy oak doors swung shut, leaving the room to the sound of Sloane's first, piercing scream of realization. The silence that followed the heavy thud of the oak doors was more deafening than the scream Sloane Thorne finally let out. It was a jagged, ugly sound that tore through the refined air of the ballroom, shattering the last remnants of the gala's prestige. The elite of the city stood frozen, their champagne flutes suspended like glass icons of a dying era. Sloane scrambled toward the stage, her designer heels skidding on a patch of spilled Pinot Noir. The crimson liquid soaked into the hem of her ivory gown, spreading like a fresh wound. She clawed at the edge of the podium, her eyes fixed on the projector screen where the evidence of her fraud remained etched in glowing white light. "It's a lie," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she turned to the crowd. "She's a soldier, a professional liar. She hacked the servers. Julian, tell them it's a forgery." Julian Vane didn't move toward her. Instead, he took a deliberate step back, the polished leather of his shoes squeaking against the marble. He adjusted his silk tie, his gaze flickering toward the exit Cassian had just used. The man who had been Sloane's shadow for 3 years suddenly looked at her as if she were a biohazard. "The audit trail is verified, Sloane," Julian said, his voice devoid of its usual sycophantic warmth. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a silver pen, and placed it on a nearby bistro table. It was a symbolic gesture, the surrender of the CFO. "I've already spoken with the board. We're distancing the firm from your personal discrepancies immediately." The skin around Sloane's eyes puckered, turning a sickly, mottled gray as the realization took hold. Her breath came in ragged, wet hitches, her perfectly painted lips trembling so violently she looked less like a socialite and more like a landed fish gasping for air. The arrogance that had defined her posture for a decade collapsed, her shoulders slumped, and the heavy diamond necklace around her throat seemed to weigh her down like a lead yoke. She looked small, frantic, and utterly exposed. "You can't do this," she whimpered, her gaze darting to the front row. "Judge Sterling, tell them this isn't legal. My father's will was absolute." Judge Abraham Sterling stood slowly, his presence commanding the room's attention. He didn't look at Sloane with anger, but with a cold, judicial pity that was far more cutting. He reached into his coat and produced a leather-bound folder, the gold seal of the probate court catching the light. "The will you presented was a secondary draft, Sloane," the judge stated, his voice booming through the hall. "Sarah Jenkins provided the original, authenticated document 3 hours ago. It was held in a secure military trust, overseen by Captain Elias. Your father knew exactly what you were, and he ensured that Cassian Thorne was the sole executor of the Thorne estate. You haven't been the owner of that house, or this company, for the last 6 months. You've been a squatter." A collective gasp rippled through the witnesses. Sarah Jenkins stood near the judge, her arms crossed, a faint, satisfied smirk playing on her lips as she watched the woman who had once tried to have her blacklisted from the industry. "The accounts are frozen, Sloane," Sarah added, her voice sharp and professional. "Every cent you spent on this gala, that dress, and your investments was stolen from the Thorne legacy. The authorities are waiting in the lobby to discuss the wire fraud." Sloane's knees hit the marble. The sound was sharp, a hollow crack that echoed. She looked up at the faces of the people she had looked down upon for years. They weren't offering hands to help her up. They were pulling out their phones, capturing the image of her ruin for the morning headlines. "She can't take the house," Sloane hissed, a final, desperate spark of venom in her eyes. "It's my home. She can't just throw me out." "She already has," Captain Elias said, stepping forward from the shadows of the wings. The old shipyard foreman looked taller than he had in years, his chest out, his hand resting on the heavy brass key he had guarded for Cassian. "The locks were changed 10 minutes ago. Your belongings are being moved to the curb as we speak." Cassian's orders were very specific. Nothing stays that wasn't paid for with honest work. Sloane looked around the room, searching for a single ally, but Julian Vane was already halfway to the door, and the elite were turning their backs, forming small circles of whispered gossip. She was a ghost in her own kingdom. The smell of ozone from the cooling projector mingled with the scent of expensive lilies, a cloying, funeral aroma. Sloane reached out to grab Julian's sleeve as he passed, but he jerked away, his face twisted in disgust. "Don't touch me," he snapped. "I have a reputation to save." Sloane Thorne was left alone on the stage, a fallen queen in a stained dress, surrounded by the wreckage of a life built on sand. Outside, the sirens began to wail, a low, rhythmic pulse that grew louder with every passing second. The Thorne estate sat on the hill, its windows dark and silent, waiting for its true mistress to return. But as the first police cruiser pulled into the gala's circular drive, the question wasn't just about what Sloane had lost. It was about what Cassian had sacrificed to win it. 6 months had passed since the lights went out on the Thorne Gala, and the salt-heavy air of the North Atlantic finally smelled like progress rather than decay. Cassian Thorne stood on the edge of the dry dock, the wind whipping her dark hair across her face. Below her, the hull of the Stellaris, the first ship commissioned under her new leadership, glowed under a fresh coat of marine-grade paint. The rhythmic clang of hammers against steel and the sharp, ozone scent of welding torches filled the air, a symphony of industry that had been silent for far too long. Captain Elias walked up beside her, his weathered face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. He adjusted his cap, looking out at the bustling shipyard with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of 2 generations of her family. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. The way the men and women on the floor moved with purpose was enough of a testament to the change she had brought. They weren't working for a ghost anymore. They were working for a Thorne who actually knew the difference between a bulkhead and a balance sheet. "The sea trials are set for Tuesday," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "She's a sturdy girl. Your father would have been proud of the modifications you made to the engine room." Cassian nodded, though a small ache tightened in her chest. "He would have hated that it took a scandal to get me back here, Elias, but he would have loved the results." She reached into her coat pocket and felt the cool, heavy weight of the Thorne's signet ring. It was no longer a symbol of unearned vanity, but a tool of management. Her phone buzzed, a notification from Sarah Jenkins. The forensic audit was officially closed. Every cent Sloane had siphoned into offshore accounts had been tracked, frozen, and clawed back into the company's operating budget. Julian Vane had avoided prison by turning state's evidence, but he was a pariah in the financial world now, relegated to a basement office in a third-rate firm, his reputation as a kingmaker shattered beyond repair. Later that afternoon, Cassian found herself in the sterile, wood-paneled chambers of Judge Abraham Sterling. This was the final formality, the signing of the documents that would permanently dissolve Sloane's remaining claims to the estate. The door opened, and the air in the room seemed to sour. Sloane Thorne entered, escorted by a court-appointed attorney who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The transformation was jarring. The woman who had once spent $10,000 on a single evening skincare routine now looked haggard and gray. Her hair, once a masterpiece of high-end highlights, was dull and pulled back in a severe, messy knot. She wore a cheap, off-the-rack blazer that hung loosely on her frame, the fabric pilling at the cuffs. Sloane didn't look at the judge. She looked at the desk, her fingers twitching as she reached for the cheap plastic pen provided by the court. "Sign here, Miss Thorne," Judge Abraham Sterling said, his voice devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for the family. He didn't even look up from his ledger. Sloane's hand trembled. She glanced at Cassian, and for a second the old fire of entitlement flickered in her eyes. "You think you've won," she hissed, her voice thin and cracked. "You're just a glorified mechanic playing dress-up in a dead man's office. You'll burn it all down eventually. You don't have the stomach for what it takes to stay on top." Cassian didn't flinch. She didn't feel the surge of rage that used to define her interactions with her sister. Instead, she felt a profound, hollow pity. "I'm not trying to stay on top of anyone, Sloane. I'm just trying to keep the ships afloat, something you never understood." The scratch of the pen on the paper sounded like a final nail. As Sloane was let out, she stumbled slightly, her sensible, low-heeled shoes squeaking on the linoleum. She was heading back to the two-bedroom apartment in the city's industrial district, the only asset the court allowed her to keep to prevent her from becoming a total ward of the state. There were no cameras there, no PR teams, no Julian to whisper lies about her greatness, just the silence of a life built on sand. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the harbor in shades of bruised purple and gold, Cassian walked back to her car. She had the company. She had the legacy. She had the justice she had spent years planning for. But as she looked at the empty passenger seat, she realized the cost. She had become a master of shadows to beat a queen of lies. The girl who had left for the military with a heart full of simple dreams was gone, replaced by a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a human life. She started the engine, the powerful hum of the vehicle vibrating through her palms. The horizon was clear, but the weight of the Thorne name felt heavier than ever. She had reclaimed the kingdom, but she would always be the one who had to guard the gates. She drove toward the shipyard, leaving the wreckage of the past in her rearview mirror, heading toward a future that was finally, exhaustingly, her own.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.